Hello and welcome. I'm Kevin Baker, and I'm the director of the New York City chapter of the Living New Deal. At the Living New Deal, we are making the New Deal of the 1930s come alive for Americans today. We map New Deal public works and artworks, we publicize the work of the New Deal, and we advocate for New Deal type programs. To find out more, please visit our website at livingnewdeal.org. There you will find our national map of New Deal sites where you can see where they are by zooming in on your state, city, or locale. The website in general is really an invaluable historical archive packed with information on New Deal programs, New Deal art, books about the New Deal, and much, much more. We also have available resources such as these really cool foldable maps for New York and other major cities, just gorgeous, as you can see. If you like what you see here or on our websites and want to learn more, please sign up for our newsletter mailing list, follow our social media posts, and look for our coming events. You can also help with our work by making a donation. Unfortunately, Timothy Mellon once again turned down our grant request this year for $50 million. Unlike certain individuals we might name, we depend on hundreds of people like you to keep us going and growing. You can donate by card, PayPal, Venmo, check, transfer, etc. Ongoing monthly donations are especially helpful, and future bequests bring tears to our eyes. So no stranger set of political bedfellows has ever worked together more effectively than those who remade America's greatest city. President Franklin Roosevelt, Mayor Fiorello La Guardia, and master builder Robert Moses were all men of towering talents and egos, at least two of whom deeply hated each other. How they transformed the devastated metropolis that was New York into a great working and middle-class city, one of the outstanding achievements of the New Deal, is the subject of this webinar. It will be featuring three outstanding scholars. I'll introduce them in the order in which they will appear. Mason B. Williams is Associate Professor of Leadership Studies and Political Science at Williams College. His first book, City of Ambition, FDR, LaGuardia, and the Making of a Modern New York, was a New York Times Book Reviewer's Editor's Choice. His next book, In Search of a Democratic City, Race, Inequality, and the Remaking of New York, will be out next summer. His writing and commentary have appeared in outlets such as The Atlantic, Dissent, The New Republic, New York Magazine, the New York Daily News, the New York Times, the New York Times Book Review, and the Washington Post. Professor Kimberley Johnson is a professor of social and cultural analysis at New York University. Dr. Johnson's research is focused on cities and urban political development, and she is the author of several articles and books, including the forthcoming Dark Concrete, The Rise and Fall of Black Power Urbanism, 1960 to 1980. Terry Golway is the author of many books, most recently of I Never Did Like Politics, How Fiorello La Guardia Became America's Mayor and Why He Still Matters. A longtime journalist and an adjunct professor of U.S. history at the College of Staten Island, Terry will be batting third for us tonight. I will leave them to it. When we are finished, we will have a question and answer period for our scholars. So get your questions ready for the end of their presentations, and I'll be back then to field them and present them. In the meantime, enjoy. Professor Williams.
Thank you very much. Let me get a slideshow up here quickly. And there we go. So since I'm starting things off, thought I would do something of a broad overview, a sketch of these three personalities, the circumstances that brought them together, their relationships with each other, a little bit about the works they created. Some of this might be familiar to some of you, especially the New Yorkers, where I marvel at the fact that the power broker is still immediately required reading for anybody who moves to New York City a half century on from its publication. It's a truly remarkable thing, but we'll have a chance to get into greater detail too. So let's start with Roosevelt and LaGuardia, pictured here. Two more outwardly dissimilar people one could hardly imagine. Roosevelt, the jaunty, smiling scion of the Hudson Valley landed gentry. LaGuardia, the sweaty, scowling, sometimes profane son of immigrants. LaGuardia referred to the pair of them as the son of the revolution and the son of the steerage. Born the same year, 1882, 11 months and some 90 miles apart, a proximity that belied the very different worlds from which they sprang. Roosevelt, raised in the quasi-aristocratic setting of Hyde Park, LaGuardia, the son of an Italian father and a Sephardic mother, was born in Greenwich Village on what's now Sullivan Street, but actually grew up in the Arizona Territory in Prescott, where his father, who was an army band leader, was stationed. Roosevelt becomes a Democrat, serves in the state Senate, and serves as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. In 1920, is slated as the vice presidential candidate. Of course, at that point, disaster strikes for him and he loses the use of his legs. Survives in politics in large measure by making an alliance with the Irish Catholic politicos he had formerly scorned, above all, New York State Governor Al Smith, a fact which is going to become important when we come back to Robert Moses in just a second. In 1928, Smith, who's running for president, asks FDR to run for governor of New York. He wins a very narrow election, is reelected 2 years later in a landslide, which puts him on the inside track for the 1932 Democratic presidential candidate nomination, and the rest is history. LaGuardia, partly because he was raised in the West, becomes a Republican. He grew up in Arizona. He always thought of himself as a Westerner. When he was mayor of New York, he went around in a big black Stetson hat. He took his political cues from Western progressives like Robert La Follette and George Norris. Upon moving to New York in his mid-20s, he joins the local Republican club, finds that anti-Tammany politics is consistent with his own vision of good government, and works his way up, winning first the nomination for Congress. He actually meets Roosevelt for the first time when he's serving as a congressman on active duty in Italy during World War I. They cross paths in Turin. Both of them have amazing memories for personalities. They both recall this years later. He has tremendous personal setbacks in the early 20s too, at almost exactly the same moment Roosevelt does. When both his wife and young daughter die of tuberculosis, and he himself is rebuilding his career in the 1920s, much in the way that Franklin Roosevelt was. They end up coming together in the early 1930s because they have similar ideas about how to respond to the Great Depression. The party division still keeps them apart. In 1933, when LaGuardia, in the aftermath of some great Tammany Hall scandals, runs for mayor of New York, Roosevelt and his political advisors, especially a guy named Jim Farley of New York, know that LaGuardia is likely to win in a head-to-head contest with the Tammany Democratic candidate and choose to put into the race their own pro-New Deal anti-Tammany candidate. It doesn't cost LaGuardia the election. He wins anyway. But they quickly managed to put that behind them. The Roosevelt-LaGuardia alliance becomes a matter of public comment. By 1935, one Brooklyn political columnist writes that LaGuardia had, quote, a confidential relationship with Mr. Roosevelt enjoyed by no Democrat. The doors of the White House open at his radiant approach, and the president is never too busy to sit down and have a chat with him. These two were not close friends. I'm not sure how many of those Franklin Roosevelt really had at the end of the day. But they liked each other personally. They were both kind of jokesters and gregarious types. They enjoyed each other's company. They admired each other. LaGuardia viewed Roosevelt's political leadership as the force that made possible many things that he had been fighting for years, including when he was a member of Congress. Roosevelt thought very highly of how LaGuardia handled the mayoralty in New York. He's said to have pulled a Democratic ward boss aside at a dedication of one public works administration project and told him that he considered LaGuardia, quote, a great man. And they were very much political allies. Now let's turn to Robert Moses, here seated with Franklin Roosevelt. It's a half-decade younger than both Roosevelt and LaGuardia. Born to affluent German Jewish parents, he spent the first part of his childhood almost literally in the shadow of Yale University, to which he returns for his undergraduate degree before studying the English Civil Service at Oxford, taking his PhD in political science from Columbia. And he is a 20-something-year-old is one of these idealistic young progressive reformers who are kind of buzzing around the John Perroy Mitchell administration in New York, which comes crashing down in this just, sort of landslide rejection, driven by working class New Yorkers who toss this kind of, silk stocking style of reform out of office at the earliest opportunity. This is a big personal setback for Moses, but he finds his way back through an alliance with Al Smith, who he's introduced to by one of the great figures in New York political history, Bell Moskowitz. And this opens famously, read all about this in Kara, the door to sort of practical political power for him in a way that never would have been possible if he'd remained a pure good government reformer. So that's starting to happen for him in the 1920s. The other thing that happens is he moves from an interest primarily in administration and sort of administrative reform and these kinds of things. He keeps an interest in that. But he becomes much more interested in public works and in building large projects. And that is actually how he first encounters Franklin Roosevelt. They'd known each other a little bit, but in 1924, when Moses is serving as the head of the State Parks Council, Franklin Roosevelt's appointed by Al Smith. Those two have an interesting political relationship too, as chairman of the Taconic State Park Commission. Moses has a kind of genius for several things, but one of which is making unnecessary enemies. Sometimes you want to grab the guy and just like, what are you doing? Like, these people are going to be useful to you down the road if you let them. But I think the official term for this is a total jerk to Franklin Roosevelt, who he assumes has perhaps no political future, runs roughshod over him officially with parks projects. Probably, well, I would wager almost certainly says demeaning things behind Roosevelt's back about him personally and about Eleanor Roosevelt. By the late 1920s, Roosevelt's telling his friend Francis Perkins of Moses, quote, "I don't trust him. I don't like him and I don't trust him." LaGuardia and Moses. Moses is, I mentioned a second ago, those Tammany Hall scandals that create an opening for a reformer to run for mayor in 1933. Moses is a potential rival for that. The powers that be in the Reform Coalition say absolutely not to Moses because he's ostensibly too close to Al Smith, who came out of the Tammany machine. LaGuardia brings him in as Parks Commissioner, and at the same time, at least not in charge of this, as head of the Triborough Bridge Authority. My favorite description of their relationship is from the great biographer of LaGuardia, the great historian Thomas Kessner, who says it's like a famous marriage. They can't stand each other, but even more than that, they can't stand to be apart from each other, LaGuardia and Moses. LaGuardia, like many people of that age, stood in awe of the great engineering feats of modernity that Moses seemed to embody. He also had grand plans for rebuilding New York. He viewed Moses as somebody who could be a resource in realizing his visions for the city. At the same time, he did not have a good sense for how Moses could build up his own independent base of power in the city. LaGuardia assumed that public servants, his job as a reformer was to protect them from politics, but they were still to be subservient to the people's elected representatives. And sort of bit by bit, scene by scene in the 1930s, you see moments where this becomes clear that this new institution of the public authority is going to afford Moses a base for power beyond the reach of elected officials. So LaGuardia and Roosevelt, firm political allies, sometimes at odds politically, but basically sort of engaged collaboratively in the New Deal project. LaGuardia and Moses realize they can use each other to mutual advantage. The next piece here we have to sort of understand the institutions of the American state to understand this relationship fully. So here's the last big thing. When the New Dealers came to power in March 1933, there was not much of a federal state, a national state to speak of. To engage in projects that Roosevelt did, like putting 4 million, Americans back to work practically overnight with programs like the CWA and the Public and the Works Project Administration, you needed the capacity that municipal governments possessed. And because of this legacy of progressive reform, New York's ability to undertake big projects far outstripped that of any other locality in the country. Just to put a fine point on this, in 1933, on the eve of the New Deal, half of all federal employees worked in the post office, right? So that's the extent to which the New Deal as a project relied on these local partners. And because of this long history of kind of progressive thinking about how to reuse government or how to use government in new ways, there were all kinds of ideas on offer. This is just, don't get lost in the details here, but this is just a sort of snapshot of the right-hand column is the percent above the municipal budget that the Works Progress Administration spent through each of these municipal departments on labor costs. And you see the number one beneficiary there is Robert Moses's Parks Department. The New Deal channeled 826% above the municipal budget into Moses's Parks Department. And you think, how did Robert Moses come up with this reputation of being this, extraordinary bureaucrat who's capable of undertaking these seemingly impossible feats, right? It helps a lot that his budget was, nearly an order of magnitude larger than it would have been without Roosevelt's WPA. And you see, starting in 1934, these magnificent projects open up across the city. Here's the Astoria Park Pool project, the Hellgate Bridge in the distance. And here the Triborough Bridge itself in the foreground. You see the Astoria Park Pool below it. Later on, you can see sort of in the background there where the Queensbridge houses are going to be. So just to close out here, I think what the New Deal did in New York far exceeded Moses's projects alone. We lost sight of that fact for many years because of the power of Caro's biography. I think the Living New Deal project maps in particular really helped show just how much beyond parks and grand public works the New Deal did in New York. Murals, arts projects, health projects, all kinds of local improvements. But Moses was a huge part of it. So I will close this by quoting the words of Hugh S. Johnson, who New Deal historians know as the first head of the National Recovery Administration, but who helped launch the WPA in New York City. Said, quote, "We're going to make New York a front door for this nation that the nation can be proud of." And I think there is no question that Roosevelt, LaGuardia, and Moses did exactly that. So with that, let me pass it to my friend and colleague, Kimberley Johnson.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to pick up a little bit on what Mason has talked about in terms of the capacity and the sort of expansiveness that occurs in New York City's own sort of New Deal. I'm going to share find the screen. Here it is. Great. Okay, so in keeping with the theme, I was really interested in thinking about what is the relationship between Fiorello La Guardia, Robert Moses, FDR, and what I was really interested about is thinking about what LaGuardia means to me. I live close to a very playful statue of LaGuardia. And my image of LaGuardia is the mayor of the little people. And so I was really thinking about the different ways in which LaGuardia is trying to create a modern city for the little people, while Robert Moses is really sort of thinking about making a modern city for making a modern metropolis, really. And it's not really about the little people, it's about kind of moving things around. So the story begins, I think, with the Great Depression and the election of both FDR and Fiorello La Guardia. They have a sort of, as Mason said, a really good working relationship. And this helps New York City, in particular, become the leader in how big cities grapple with the sort of devastation of the New Deal. So New York City, because of LaGuardia's relationship, and I think also because of, as Mason said, its capacity to sort of do things in ways that many other state and local governments kind of didn't have the ability to do so, that New York City receives more federal funds than any other city in the nation. And because of this, it receives billions of dollars. And because of this, it's able to sort of create this incredible civic infrastructure. So schools, bridges, parks, hotels, highways, airports, stadiums, Triborough Bridge, Holland Lincoln tunnels, all these sort of marvelous things, both separately and also in partnership, somewhat partnership with FDR. So my story begins with really a story of very little people. And so one way for me thinking about the relationship of the New Deal and New York City is to look at LaGuardia's war on push carts. So LaGuardia comes into office, and one of the many things that he does is he essentially says, well, we're going to get rid of push carts. And it's hard to imagine what the landscape of New York City looked like before this war on push carts. If you were a recent immigrant to New York City, one of the first things that you probably were told is, you know what, if you need to make money, why don't you rent a push cart? So you have clusters of push cart sellers all around New York City. Lower East Side is most famous for them, but they're really everywhere throughout New York City. And by 1912, there's actually a push cart commission because it's just sort of chaos. You know, you have push carts, you have now cars, you have subways, you have buses. It's just complete chaos. And so the push cart commission essentially says, well, why don't we kind of centralize these push carts into actual public markets? And so even at the beginning of the 20th century, there's this idea that we need to sort of clean up the streets and really make this a functional city. By 1917, there's a Department of Markets that's created. And by 1923, they've actually kind of managed to consolidate these push carts into these sort of more cohesive, centralized marketplaces, including the Bronx Market, Brooklyn's Wallabout Market, and in Manhattan, 3 that you probably know about, West Washington, Gansevoort, and Fulton Fish Markets. And so this is a sense of like, how do we make a modern city? But still you have lots and lots of push cart sellers, and the Great Depression happens, and it just sort of explodes because people are trying to figure out a way to make a living. So in 1929, there was a study, and they found that there were still 57 open air markets for about 6,000 push carts. So LaGuardia, again, sort of pushes for, let's clean this up, let's really centralize. And he's really thinking about not only are these push cart sellers and the conditions, the really kind of tough, deplorable conditions that they're existing in, they're outside in all sorts of weather, but also thinking about the retailers who are saying, hey, listen, we have these push cart sellers that are right outside of our retail stores, and they're really cutting into our very already threatened business. So he pushes forward this for the construction of at its end 10 markets. This is one of the markets. This is First Avenue Retail Market, and it's actually designed by a team of in-house architects. And what's really remarkable is that they really, I think, in terms of thinking about the architecture of the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, they really, I think, embody this kind of civic architecture. I mean, they just are really quite marvelous buildings that are designed to make the lives of the vendors as well as the shoppers easier. So it's really quite interesting. So they actually have a couple of different kinds of rules. They have rules over signs. They have rules over where the sort of vendors are allowed to stand and how they're supposed to stand. They have rules about vendors have to be courteous, which is sort of amusing given that it's New York City. They have another rule that there should be no shouting or hawking by vendors nor abusive or lewd language. You know, it's all great and aspirational, of course. And then disputes between customer and peddler should be handled by one of the on-site supervisors behind the closed doors of their offices. So it really is this idea of like, let's professionalize and really make these places better opportunities for the sellers as well as for the shoppers. So this is LaGuardia on one of the opening days of the of one of the markets, and it really is pretty successful in many ways. I'll get into what happens next, but for now I'll move on to the second part, which is that now you have this sort of network of public markets, and at the same time, you have Robert Moses. And Robert Moses, I think, as hopefully many of you know, has a very different vision of what New York City should be. And it's very much a top-down vision. I mean, I think any sort of artifact that you see Robert Moses, it's him sort of looking down and sort of seeing this very abstract landscape upon which he's going to sort of put his imprint on. And these are sort of abstract landscapes in which people are really invisible. The little people are just simply not there. And so I think it's a very interesting way of thinking about the difference between LaGuardia and Moses, is that the little people sort of are not in his grand vision of New York City. So on the map on, I guess it's on the right, this just gives you a sense of just some of the sort of interventions that Moses is able to push through in terms, despite his very contentious relationship with LaGuardia. And again, I think as Mason mentioned too, they did not get along. And as Robert Caro famously says in his biography, Moses is able to kind of very skillfully kind of grab hold of power and is able just to sort of do things without LaGuardia or any other mayor really having any power to sort of push back. And so this is the sort of model that we see of LaGuardia, of Robert Moses. So I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about the Cross Manhattan Expressway, or LOMEX, or Lower Manhattan Expressway, because in many ways, this is where we see, I think, the sort of clash between these two very different visions of New York City and what a modern city should look like. I focus on LOMEX, the Lower Manhattan Expressway, because it really kind of skirts very closely to one of the remaining public markets, which is the Essex Street Market. So you can imagine that this is a huge project, that it is actually the project in which Jane Jacobs really sort of gets well known for in terms of her ability to stop it. And I just want to quote, I want to just give you a quotation from Robert Moses to give you a sense of how he sort of thinks about what is he doing in this landscape. And so this is Robert Moses. You can draw any kind of picture you like on a clean slate and indulge your every whim in the wilderness in laying out a New Delhi, Canberra, or Brasilia. But when you operate in an overbuilt metropolis, you have to hack your way with a meat axe. And this is just really, again, this meat axe that is just going through parts of the Lower Side, going through Soho. It's actually going up through my stomping grounds of NYU, and actually kind of going through Washington Square Park with a highway. And so this is, again, this is a city not for little people. This is a city for other people to get through, suburbanites, trucks, manufacturers, but not really for the people who actually live and shop in the city. This just gives you a sense on a sort of a modern map of the scale of where the Lower Manhattan Expressway was envisioned to go through. And it really is just, again, kind of cutting this huge path through Lower Manhattan. If you look on your sort of lower, hopefully I can show it, somewhere around here is Essex Street Market, which was the second of these public markets. And so really these are not benign things. These are really, now that we know in the sort of aftermath of urban renewal and urban highways, these are city killing events. And so what happens is, of course, famously, Jane Jacobs is able to stop this, as well as other activists, and it sort of dies a slow death. But I think what I really want to just explore just for a little bit is really thinking about the ways in which we have two very distinct visions of what the city, a New Deal city, could look like. One is LaGuardia, which really is focusing on kind of building upon these previous progressive efforts to reshape the city, to expand the sort of civic infrastructure of the city, and to really make a city that works for all, versus, I think, Robert Moses, who I think in his mind probably thought this is a great vision of a city in which that worked efficiently, that wasn't overbuilt, that was built sort of perfectly, that was, modern, and that accommodated the car, which was seen as sort of cutting edge of modernity. But it was just simply a clash that was uneasy, and in many ways, the city of LaGuardia rested uneasily alongside of the city of Robert Moses. So what happens in the end? But what happens really in the end is that Lomax is defeated, but history actually defeats Essex Street Market as well. By the 1950s and 1960s, suburbanization is occurring. People are no longer shopping in places like Essex Street Markets. We have the rise of supermarkets. And it's sort of, as well as the other remaining public markets, sort of lose their way. What's fascinating is that in the early 2000s, Essex Street gets sort of a new beginning, and it gets incorporated into a new, much larger real estate development. And so I think what I would leave with this is this idea of thinking about how we can look at these really, I think, kind of quiet and almost forgotten artifacts of the WPA as symbols or embodiments of the struggle of what kind of city did we want then and what kind of city do we want today. So I think with that, I'm actually going to hand it off to Terry Golway.
Thanks. And thanks to both of you for your presentations. So being a political journalist, which I've been for most of my career, not necessarily a scholar like our two presenters already, I want to talk a little bit about the interplay among an amazing cast of characters. There's Moses, LaGuardia, and Roosevelt, obviously. That's why you're watching. But there's Al Smith and Harold Ickes and all sorts of characters who are involved in the drama that is New York City during the New Deal. And again, I haven't read nearly as much as my two other predecessors have about this topic. But what strikes me, I think, what might explain how Roosevelt, who clearly hated Moses, LaGuardia wasn't so keen on him at times, but there was one thing I think that they probably agreed on, was that it was really important during the early years of the New Deal to make sure that things got done, right? The common criticism of the PWA and then the WPA was that the federal government was handing money out, and the stereotype was men sitting around with shovels, not doing anything. But that wasn't true in New York, and I'm not sure it was true, in other places as well. It was a stereotype of anti-New Dealers, but it was still something that they had to deal with. And what became obvious early on in the Roosevelt administration, early on the New Deal, through the Parks Department, is that money that was funneled from Washington to New York to the city Parks Department was leading to astonishing improvements in the city's parks and new parks. Parks were being built during these early years of the PWA, especially. And that made an impression on Roosevelt. It certainly made an impression on LaGuardia, because that was what he wanted people to say, right? In New York, there was no, Tammany was gone. You're not handing money out to Jimmy Walker or to the Tammany machine. You're handing money to somebody who knows how to get things done. And, you know, Robert Moses was the guy getting stuff done. So I think that was an important thing for all of these people during this time, is that New York stood as an example of something that could get done with New Deal money. And I'm reminded in my sort of tale of Fiorello La Guardia. I wouldn't call it a biography, but it's sort of a collection of interesting stories about him. But at one point, and I've totally got this from Thomas Kessner, whose biography of Fiorello La Guardia is never going to be surpassed. But at one point, Lorena Hickok is sort of out going around the country, acting as Harry Hopkins' eyes and ears about how is WPA money being spent. And, you know, in a lot of her letters, she's sort of saying, we actually could be spending money better. Maybe we need to light a fire under some people, until she gets to New York. And she writes back in astonishment in 1936, where she literally says to Hopkins, listen, mister, things are getting done in New York. And it's almost with a sense of, there's a bit of a sense of disbelief, but there's also clearly an implicit criticism of other places where things were not getting done. And so, you know, as we've already heard from Mason about the extraordinary amount of money that gets funneled into New York during the New Deal, and you know, money makes things happen, and all of these amazing improvements and rebuilding of the city happens because of money, right? But why is that money being funneled into New York? Why is New York allowed to make decisions about WPA money that other municipalities are not allowed to make on their own? And it's because New York is showing the country what can get done with this funding. And, you know, I think at the end of the day, that ability to get things done is what kept the balance in this sort of three-way relationship. Now, we know that, you know, Roosevelt tried to get Moses basically fired from the Triborough Bridge Commission through Administrative Order 129, which all of you New Deal fans know, right, was an order basically specifically for Robert Moses, saying that the PWA under Harold Ickes wasn't going to fund any project in which, you know, one of the commissioners was a municipal official, Robert Moses, right? And it, you know, it gets out in the press. I mean, it's clear that Roosevelt is trying to get Moses fired from the Triborough Bridge Commission. And it's in the press. There's no cover up. There's no spin. That's what it is. And that, you know, that led to an extraordinary conflict between the Roosevelt administration, Harold Ickes, and LaGuardia, because now LaGuardia is in a position of saying, it's either Moses or the Triborough Bridge. You know, it's what am I going to do? And Moses very cleverly, you know, makes sure that New York knows that the funding is drying up. I mean, the funding isn't coming. And LaGuardia is being pressured by Ickes. You know, he's being told the president himself is involved in this administrative order. And the press is pretty much on Moses' side, or, you know, on the city side, saying this is unfair. You know, this can't happen. Who is Franklin Roosevelt or Harold Ickes to tell New York who should be on a commission? And interestingly enough, somebody who breaks the deadlock is Al Smith. Smith, you know, at one point, you know, of course, Smith is the person who brings Robert Moses into political life, as Mason pointed out. And I think at this point, he's not quite the anti-New Deal. He's getting close, though. But he gives a press conference in which he says that this is tremendously unfair. And, Robert Moses is the guy who's getting stuff done in this city. And, this really has to stop. This is just complete, nonsense. And sure enough, the next day is when there's a compromise reached, which is too Byzantine to get into. But basically, LaGuardia and Roosevelt themselves figured out a compromise statement to make about basically with Roosevelt withdrawing from the administrative order and allowing things to happen. So if you wanted to ever question about how effective Robert Moses was behind the scenes, his ability to survive Administrative Order 129, right? Not only survive it, but then go on to prosper, is probably a pretty good example. And, I think that, Roosevelt certainly didn't change his opinion of Moses. Moses didn't change his opinion of Franklin Roosevelt. But I think they just, as we often say to children or students, just figure it out. Go figure it out. I think that's in essence what happens among the three of them, is that they eventually put their personal differences aside for the greater good. Now, obviously, Moses is the most controversial of this trio, and Liz remains, a figure of infamy in many places in New York. But, there's also no denying the fact that maybe one of the reasons we're talking about Fiorello La Guardia today in the ways that we do is because he had Franklin Roosevelt, but also because he had Robert Moses as well. So again, I am loath to go deep into public policy because as a journalist, we know that's not an area in which I specialize. But I do think that the play of those three personalities, and again, you add in Harold Ickes and you add in Al Smith, and, if I were a more talented writer like Kevin Baker, there might be a novel in that or an opera. But on that note, I will send it back to Kevin and welcome any questions.
Well, thanks so much, Terry. I've yet to write an opera, but who knows? It certainly would be worth an opera writing about those personalities alone. Would one of you want to talk a little bit about, talking about getting things done in New York? Odd as that sounds today, would anyone want to talk a little bit about kind of the 100 days of LaGuardia and how his administration gets right off the jump once they come in 34, in part because of Moses and the setup he has at the Armory and in Central Park?
There, you want to go for it?
Go ahead, Mason.
No. Oh, my
Yeah.
lights just went off.
Uh-oh. Yep. And do you go ahead, Mason?
No. I think LaGuardia had been taking notes the previous spring with FDR's 100 days. There are even parallels. Roosevelt famously flies to Chicago to accept the nomination in person in 1932, right, from Albany. LaGuardia comes back from a vacation. Likewise, like in the, just sort of like make a show of like sort of just as intense to his intentions to sort of get right down to it and move into action. LaGuardia is sort of self-conscious about taking office with a flurry of activity. He's got the newsreels rolling. He confiscates all the slot machines and takes them out on a barge in the East River. Hits him with a hammer and a dumped in and, all this sort of thing. I think the sort of like the bigger story in some ways is, well, there are two things. One is that LaGuardia, whenever he cuts a ribbon on something, he always says, and this is the getting stuff done part, people have been talking about this project for 20 years. With the reform administration, now that we've got Tammany out of here and we've got real professionals like Moses in, we're actually doing it, right? And there's two parts of that. One is the fact that there were all these ideas percolating around for how to use government in new ways to give people access to recreation, to public health, all the rest of it, right? To education, the open air reading rooms and stuff. Those ideas were there to take and run with. But then you also had people like Moses and LaGuardia himself, who are kind of masters at pushing this administration as fast as it could go. Roosevelt at one point calls LaGuardia America's #1 cutter of red tape. Right. That's partly because
Yeah.
he's able to form these really successful relationships
Yeah.
with people like Ickes, with people like Harry Hopkins,
Yeah.
other figures. Morgenthau and Treasury is important in this too. Where the second they run into problems, Roosevelt or LaGuardia is able to go to Washington and reach these kind of agreements, sort of workarounds that allow for WPA labor to be used on LaGuardia Airport, for example. It wouldn't formally have been allowed to do.
And but they had projects ready, as we heard the whole controversy over it during the Obama administration. What was, shovel ready
Shovel ready,
projects,
right? Yeah,
thanks to Moses kind of forcing everyone into
yeah.
the armory. New York had shovel ready projects before anyone else, right?
There's a great moment in 1935. LaGuardia is going down to talk to Roosevelt and gets wind of the fact that, the sort of big bill has gone through, but they're not sure what agencies are going to come out of it. And he comes back with an idea for what the WPA is going to be. And the next day, before you know it, Moses has sent over this entire pile of plans for how to use this new federal labor, right? And that's the period, New York gets the most money from the New Deal because it's the biggest city. But there is a moment where something like 1 out of 7 dollars being spent nationally by the WPA is going to New York. That's for the second half of 1935, and that's because they are just so quick off the marks. Once the New Deal's largest program goes into effect.
Kim, do you think if I mean, the Lomax was one thing he had planned, Moses, and he also hacked his way with the meat hacks through the Bronx with the Cross Bronx Expressway, and pretty much devastated the Gut and Coney Island, among other things. And I think he also wanted to put some super highway through mid-Manhattan. I mean, would New York really be habitable if all that had gone down? Much of it was proposed, of course, after LaGuardia and FDR were gone from the scene, but would the city be just a wreck now if that had happened?
That's a great question. I mean, I think if you ask probably many planners, urban planners and urban historians about the long-term effect of urban highways, they'd say yes, that you would only have to look at, I won't name names, but I mean, there are certainly, I think, a number of American cities where, the highways went through, maybe, crisscrossed the city, and that really just kind of upended and kind of ended really a city. And I think what's interesting about this moment is that as these urban highways kind of come to their end, that the sort of push now is to actually think about how do we remove these highways? How do we remove these highways, and how do you sort of repair the many neighborhoods that were sort of devastated and displaced by these highways? So I think New York City was very lucky in the sense that it really, I mean, the Bronx not so much, but Manhattan I think was very lucky, and that it was able to not have these massive highways go right through. Certainly Manhattan, it's sort of most valuable port, and then Soho, which turns out to be probably another sort of valuable part of the city.
Yeah. And you mentioned the Essex Street Market, a place I loved, and it really seemed to have kind of come back and be a very kind of clean, friendly place to go shopping. And then as you say, it got kind of usurped by this enormous, ugly, very wealthy housing development across the street. And last time I was over there, it's supposedly everybody was getting a space in the basement. Last time I was over there, that was going bankrupt or was shuttered or something. So, is this the new urban plight of kind of, crazy affluent projects driving everyone out? Or
well, I mean, I think this is the debate, right? Is how much centralization is needed? How much, do you use an axe or a scalpel? And you often don't really know whether which one works until the project is finished.
Yeah.
And so I think
Yeah.
it's interesting. I think that Essex Street crossing was an attempt to kind of take the Essex market and kind of transport it into the 21st century, but it was very much bound up in this sort of much larger real estate development, and COVID didn't help. So
Yeah, yeah, and it's
Yeah.
closed now. I mean, boy, somebody should
Yeah.
open that up.
Yeah.
Terry, terrific as Moses was at leading both LaGuardia and FDR's attempts to control him, they were able to do so to a certain degree. I mean, do you want to tell that story about the Moses's attempt to take over housing in New York in the 30s and how LaGuardia thwarted it?
Yes, I'll be the first to tell you, I'm ashamed to admit I don't remember whether that's in Caro or Kessner, or maybe it's in both.
I
But
think Kessner, but yeah.
I think it is Kessner.
Yeah.
Mason, is that also in your book too? This story about the how Moses trying to take over the housing money?
I don't think I got into it.
Oh, okay.
Certainly not in that kind of detail.
Right. Yes, detail it was. So, Moses saw that LaGuardia was getting money for housing,
Yeah.
for federal housing projects, this is all new, right? The federal government getting involved in housing. So, of course, Moses realizes, and it is Carol or Kessner, who says Moses had never expressed any sort of interest at all in housing working class and poor people, but he saw that there was money to be made in it. So he surreptitiously figures out he's going to get a piece of this. So he plans a speech that WNYC is going to broadcast a speech live in which he's going to announce the formation of a new housing authority that will usurp NYCHA, which is a LaGuardia project. And he has specific plans, and he's going to show all of these, he's going to announce all of these developments that he's now going to fund. And this is a big speech in front of all of New York City's elites. And as I said, it's going to be broadcast on WNYC. He doesn't tell his boss, the mayor, about this plan because he's Robert Moses, right? But somehow, amazingly, LaGuardia, a politician to his bone, despite the fact that he was being one, found out what Moses was going to do. So WNYC is called that for a reason. Back then, it was the municipally owned radio station, which which LaGuardia had sort of made his home in many ways. So he basically calls in the head of WNYC and says, that speech that we're covering later on today, yeah, cut the cord. So in Kessner's description, Moses is giving the speech and everybody is oohing and ahhing, and the engineers are going through this pantomime in which they're, giving him the okay, and but the speech never appeared. There was dead air on WNYC for the entirety of the speech. Now, as Kessner goes on to point out, I mean, the print press still counted for something back then, and they all loved it. They all thought this was wonderful, but basically LaGuardia continued to undermine Moses, and Moses basically gave up the project. So you're right, Kevin. Yes, Moses was a master manipulator and maneuverer, but in Fiorello La Guardia, he found that he met his match.
I love that story. And Moses also got so angry that FDR wouldn't let him build a bridge at the Battery that he moved the aquarium out of there, right, and put it in Cody Island.
Yeah.
Let me ask you kind of a general criticism, particularly from neocons and all, about LaGuardia's New York, which has sprung up in recent years for any of you guys to answer here, which is that all this federal aid was in fact too much, that it created a New York that was too dependent on that and an unsustainable social welfare state. I find it amazing that people think everyone was just living high off the hog in 1940s and 50s and 60s New York, but that's become the criticism. Do you guys, any of you have anything to say to that, or?
I find that criticism just fascinating because Jonathan Soffer actually really nailed this in his book on his biography of Ed Koch. The number one thing that accounts for the fiscal crisis of the 1970s is rising healthcare costs, which is precisely a consequence of the giant gap in the American welfare state.
Yeah.
And you could go on about that. I mean, Jacob Javits, who's really centrally involved in forming, things that are going to become like the New York City Partnership, which we think of as a kind of like centrist, conservative-ish response to the excesses of, anti-business politics of the 1960s. Like, he's pushing for a federal jobs guarantee at the same time, right? I think that would be another way of looking at it. There are certainly sort of aspects of fiscal federalism that put New York in a difficult position when the local economy does go south after 1969. But in many ways, it's the sort of shortcomings of the national welfare state that are really kind of accountable for what happens locally to New York. A similar story could be told about housing, by the way. The state welfare housing allowances stay stagnant during the era of inflation. That's actually a big factor in the abandonment problem and arson problems in the late 70s too. So.
Interesting. Yeah. It seems to me it was just kind of, this is the minimal level people should be living at, and to make out that it was the streets are paved with gold seems ridiculous. One last question here I think we have time for. Rob Pulitzer, who's written some terrific stuff about the city himself, writes in with a question about what were the tactics that Jane Jacobs used to stop the Lomax. It sounds like a Dr. Seuss character, the Lomax. It probably is, but what were the sort of tactics that were used to stop that and the other runaway projects?
I mean, I think what Jane Jacobs is such a fascinating person. And I think when you think back on it, it's an improbable person to be the sort of face of a movement that really changes how we think about the role of citizens in planning. So I think that she is just able to get together, these little people. I mean, Robert Moses, famously says, these are nobodies, these are a bunch of housewives, but they're able to, because I think partly because of her background as a journalist, she's able to sort of craft these moments where the little people can sort of say, hey, here we are in a park with little kids and you want to put a highway through it. What does that mean? And so I think she was really effective in garnering or creating these kind of events that really sort of put city officials, more than Robert Moses, who doesn't really care, but really puts city officials in this sort of awkward moment. But I think in terms of Lomax, I mean, I think Jacobs is effective partially because Moses is becoming less effective, right? That there's this kind of pushback against Moses that's growing. The sort of machine is kind of sort of back. And by the 1960s, certainly, you get the sort of anti-highway activism that's emerging in all sorts of cities. I mean, really, it's a sort of a nationwide movement where people are saying, oh, wait a minute, we need to stop highways going into cities. It's a little late for some neighborhoods, but they're able to do this in all sorts of cities. And so often you can go to a city and see an exit that kind of ends in a neighborhood, and that usually happened around the late 1960s, early 1970s.
No,
Kevin, could I add one thing?
Sure.
The forgotten Moses pushback from my home borough of Staten Island.
Yes.
There are a number of unfinished expressways on Staten Island that were all going to be connected because of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, which I believe was Moses' last big public works project. But particularly something called the Richmond Parkway, which was going to connect the Outerbridge Crossing to the Staten Island Expressway and then to the Verrazano Bridge. That was never finished because it was going to go through what is now called Staten Island's Greenbelt. And there we saw environmentally conscious Staten Islanders in 1965 basically beat Moses at around the same time. I think that some of this other stuff is going on. Now, as someone who does travel in Staten Island quite a bit these days, I would say that, traffic is very bad on Staten Island, but thank God the Greenbelt is there because it's this wonderful piece of greenery, and it was a bunch of Staten Islanders who beat Robert Moses. End of story.
That's very interesting. And it kind of brings to mind, could it be that the little people couldn't be ignored anymore because they were no longer little people? They were citizens with rights more than they had been, and the machine was dead or dying. And and Moses couldn't just make inside deals anymore. He had to deal with this public that the New Deal had helped galvanize. So,
Right.
Well, thank you so very much for this. Wonderful presentations. We have maybe time for one more question here. Let's see. Is there any correlation between the time and people we're discussing tonight to NYC today and the Biden programs that are rolling out now? Anyone care for a quick 20-second assessment?
I mean, I think what I would say is that in some ways there's a nostalgia for Robert Moses.
Yeah.
He got things done, and sometimes I think we end up with projects that take a really, really long time to come to fruition.
Yeah.
Where I think there's a sense that maybe there's a little bit too much input, citizen input, and perhaps we should let experts be experts. But
is that kind of the kind of pushback now that we take too long for all these things? But
I mean,
That's what Andrew Cuomo said.
yeah. Although, some people would say he got around that by giving everybody what they wanted, which is another approach.
My one note I would add is there was a moment in, I think it was sort of somewhere in Bloomberg's third term where he says, for the first time since LaGuardia was mayor and FDR created the WPA, we're dreaming big dreams and we're actually achieving them in New York. I think New York in the early 21st century recovered this idea of the public as being really important. You see that in some of the refurbishing of even New Deal institutions like City Center, for example. But then also the way the sort of streets are redone and stuff. But I think it was in line with Bloomberg's idea that an excellent public sphere was necessary to attract the best and brightest to live in the city and tourists to come visit the city. And what I find most admirable about the New Deal were those projects that really were for the little people. So that you could have access to the same things that other people could pay for, and so I think, that sort of notion of palaces for the people, right? Civic infrastructure that actually is there for people as citizens, not for the city to be able to attract the people it wants to attract. That's the legacy of the New Deal that we really need to recover.
I love it. Thanks so much. Thanks very much. You are wonderful scholars here. If you liked what you saw today, please send us money. If you think we could do better, please send us money and we will use that to do better. Thanks very much. This has been the Living New Deal, livingnewdeal.org. Take a look at all we have to offer. And thank you, Dr. Johnson. Thank you, Professor Williams. Thank you, Mr. Golway. And we will see you again soon, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you.